So in my framework, I represent these different aspects of gender as part of this kind of multidimensional space. And then, I talk about how people might be positioned differently along this space, and how maybe there are different gender concepts that kind of weigh more heavily towards certain features as opposed to others. So in many ways, I kind of try to incorporate these theories more as data as opposed to directly competing with them on the grounds of, oh, I'm trying to give a different account of how people how people use terms.
Welcome, everyone, to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Kevin Richardson. He is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Duke University, and his work is focused on metaphysics, language, and social reality. His recent book is titled The End of Binaries, How Gender and Sexuality Come in Degrees, which will be our focus for today. So feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome, and thanks so much for being here, Professor Richardson.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
Awesome. So as I said in the introduction, we're going to focus on your recent book, The End of Binaries, How Gender and Sexuality Come in Degrees. I'll include links to where people can find that from OEP or Amazon, perhaps, if it's there. But just to start, could you give a bit of an overview of the book? Like, what are some of the main issues you approach, and why might someone be interested in checking it out?
Yeah, so everyone keeps saying or telling us that gender is simple, that there are two different kinds of people, male and female, and then like everything else is confusion or ideology. But recently, many people have been identifying with genders outside of the kind of binary options of male and female. People are identifying as non-binary, or people have been questioning the kind of rigidness of genders so that you can transition from one gender to another. A similar thing is happening with sexual orientation or sexuality. Old days, it was taught, okay, there's like people who are straight and there are people who are gay. Maybe there's people who are bisexual also, but it's like three categories basically that are open to you. But again, recently people have been thinking about themselves outside of the kind of gay, stray labels. Maybe they use something more general like queer, or maybe they're thinking about kind of demisexuality or different sexual orientations along the asexual spectrum. So gray sexual, for instance, is a kind of sexual orientation category that I've recently learned about and thought about, in doing this project. So there's this idea that, people are kind of trying to come outside of these binary categories, male, female on the gender side, and then straight and gay on the sexual orientation side. And there's a question of, okay, how do you think about this philosophically, right? So there's one sort of view where the thought is, well, people are kind of misdescribing themselves, or it's some sort of political movement, social movement, and things are radically changing. Whereas my perspective in this book is that, in fact, it's not really what's new is the identification, but gender and sexuality has always been, I guess, coming in degrees, right? Gender and sexuality has always been, I argue, on a spectrum, and what's happening in the current society is not so much a kind of moving away from this kind of natural position, but rather there's kind of identifying and locating oneself within this spectrum of gender and sexuality. So I try to develop what I call the spatial theory of gender and sexual orientation. And the basic idea is as follows. On a traditional view, you can think about, gender categories, for instance, male, female, as kind of like these, two rigid options. They're exclusive, they're exhaustive. That is to say, everyone falls into one category or the other, and everyone falls into at least one of them. Whereas I think about gender more like a kind of a map of a country, right? So the states on the map would be like the different sexual orientation categories. So there would be, different gender categories. So there would be male and female, but there would also be non-binary, there would be genderqueer, and then there would be all of these really, really specific points in between, right? So the thought is that you have this kind of spatial representation of what gender is. There's all these different dimensions to gender. The same thing with sexuality. And then there are kind of broad categories, something like countries. But then there's like a person's kind of GPS coordinate, right? So I say that people have gender and sexual locations. And part of the reason why I talk about this is trying to think about gender and sexuality from the perspective of the kind of diversity of human gender and sexuality. So you have kind of people located along specific points, right, on the kind of gender and sexual space is what I call it. And I try to use this as a way to give a philosophical account of what's going on that doesn't treat some of the self identifications today as a mere fad or as a misdescription, but rather treating it as capturing something that or highlighting something that really has been with us all along. It's just that we've, for various reasons, it's very convenient to think in binary terms. Right? So that's the big picture of the book, and I'm happy to expand on any of those particular parts.
Awesome. So I did want to start with maybe some kind of more methodological questions at the outset, if that's fine. Because, like, well, one thing that when we think about questions like what is gender or what is a woman, or, you know, similar questions might be applied to sexuality and sexual orientation, that might be understood more as like a ontological or metaphysical question, like what are these things like out there in the world, or maybe more as a like linguistic or semantic question, like how do these terms function in our language, or maybe it's not so easy to divorce the two. I mean, how do you view the connection between the semantics and the metaphysics here?
Good. That's a really good question. So for me, so I think for a lot of people, the way they think about this project is one where the linguistic or semantic question and the metaphysical question or ontological question more or less coincide. So what I see in the traditional methodology, and I'll say how my methodology differs. Traditional methodology is okay, if I want to know what, for instance, gender is, right? What I need to do now is to look at gender terms, right? Like male and female or man and woman. People kind of different ways to think about it. But take a pair of those terms or taking a given term, and then you want to try to give a linguistic account of what people mean when they, use those words. And then from there, right, people say, okay, I looked and found that man means such and such. And now I have my account of gender, or at least I have an account of being of the gender kind man. And then maybe you do the woman as well. Usually people focus on women. So like they start with, okay, what does the term woman mean? And then, okay, I found out what woman means. Well, whatever this is, right, it corresponds to some sort of a kind that's out there in the world. And then from there, they say, okay, I'm basically giving you more or less the metaphysics of gender. I've said what it is for someone to be male and female, and that's more or less what characterizes gender. My view is that this is a good start, but I don't think that's the place where we should finish. So my view is that when we're trying to give a metaphysical count, and a metaphysical count is supposed to be telling us something kind of about kind of deep facts about what the world is like beyond what it may appear to be. And I guess my dissatisfaction with that approach, the traditional approach, is that, while it's well, two issues. One is that there's a privileging of certain gender categories, namely male and female, and then also sexual orientation categories, gay and straight, or heterosexual and homosexual, that methodologically I think can distort the rest of your account if you just start with those two. Because my worry, of course, is that if you start with those two particular, if that particular semantic investigation, you might end up just completely ignoring the diversity of gender or sexual orientation just because you're focusing on the most kind of popular, well recognized, most discussed gender kinds or sexual orientation kinds. So I think that is a worry. But the other kind of part of it is just that, well, what about these other terms that are developing, or I guess less common, which is like non-binary, right? Are these terms supposed to be just kind of discarded or just seen as a mishmash of, a mishmash of meanings of the other two terms? Or take demisexual, for instance. How do we understand demisexuality? Seems like a sexual orientation, but it's not on the same model as the, gay and straight, it seems. So are those just kind of thrown out there in a vague kind of morass? So what I argue basically is, the semantic investigation is important, and it is something that you do need to attend to, right? I don't think you can just completely ignore everything everyone says and just say, I'm just going to tell you what gender is. I don't care how people talk about themselves. I think that's a kind of extreme position. However, I do think that what we're trying to do, again, if I'm stepping back and I'm saying, I want to get an account of gender as a whole, right? Not just two categories, or sexual orientation as a whole, not just the particular categories that we talk about a lot in this culture. Then I think we have to step back and, do some explanatory work and say, okay, what's a broader framework that we can use to explain not just the kind of current in the actual world, the kind of terms we use and what we're talking about, but in general, like what's going on with gender, what's going on with sexual orientation. That's what my framework hopes to provide. I think that, and I think it does in a way that other frameworks don't. So yeah, that's my perspective on the linguistic versus the metaphysical methodology.
Good. Yeah. I like that. And then sort of on a related note, and this is something that comes up a bit later in the book more, but like when you think about the connection between, well, this being more descriptive, whether it's descriptive metaphysics or descriptive semantics, versus something constructive, or where there's like sort of negotiation of norms and stuff like that. Like, how do you view the separation of this being a descriptive project versus a more constructed or engineered or stipulated project, if that makes sense? What do you think? Yeah, what do you think about that?
Yes. So the distinction between descriptive theorizing, so you're trying to give an account of what gender sexual orientation is. On the other hand, there's clearly kind of prescriptive element or a normative element, ethical, political element that goes with these kind of investigations. So people are often thinking about, well, how should we kind of organize gender or gender practices insofar as it can be organized? How should we think about sexual orientation? What kind of concepts ought we use? What kind of terms ought we use? So those are kind of two very much related issues. My stance is as follows. So one, I do think we have to, in principle, make the separation between them. So I think regardless of my politics, regardless of what I think ought to be the case when it comes to gender and sexual orientation, I think that, I have as a descriptive theorist, I have an obligation to try to characterize what the way the world is, even if it isn't the way I want it to be. Right. And so I don't, in my account, for instance, I do account for gender, sexual orientations, or ways of thinking, ways of kind of organizing the social world that aren't ways I approve of, right? So they're definitely not necessarily ways I approve of things, or things I necessarily approve of as a theorist. So I think that's one. I think I don't think there's any avoiding making that kind of separation. I think that's important. That said, I don't think that there's a way to, unfortunately, or fortunately, unfortunately, I don't think there's a way to kind of, for people to, as a theorist, as a person, as a flesh and blood person, to entirely divorce oneself from the different political and social issues kind of involved in theorizing about it. So as a matter of fact, it's just you're very likely to have your own substantive moral political position on questions around gender and sexual orientation and sexuality. I think that's just, unavoidable kind of feature of being a human being theorizing about human life. If I was theorizing about, rocks, maybe I wouldn't, maybe there would be no conflict of interest or anything like that. So I think that is a kind of real thing that, I think that's a kind of reality. We just have the stakes, those kind of interests. And I think it's a tough thing to, while I do think that your descriptive theorizing can actually kind of serve some political goals or moral goals, particularly in a case where you just identify certain things as just not being true descriptively, right? So that can clearly undermine the kind of moral premise. If descriptively you say, well, look, here's the way the world is. It's exclusively divided into these two sexes, male and female. If that is the strong thesis you have, then, I think I've shown that that's not true. So whatever you kind of base on that is not going to work. But of course, there's lots of sophisticated questions around this. So at the end of the book, I give a kind of little pitch for a version of what we might want to do in light of thinking about gender and sexual orientation as spatial. But, this book is primarily about trying to understand what's going on in a lot of these cases. And I think that can shed some light on why the descriptive theorizing itself is a very hotly contested sort of issue. Why, to even suggest that gender can come in degrees or sexual orientation can come in degrees is a kind of very provocative morally and socially to some people. Whereas, I think of it as that itself is descriptive. I actually don't think it really implies some grand social or normative proposal by itself.
Good. Yeah, yeah. So I guess on that, then I guess we should talk a bit about gender binaries. Like, uh, what is a gender binary? Why is it, perhaps for better or worse, kind of as entrenched as it is? And yeah, maybe if you could talk about that a bit.
Absolutely. So a gender binary, basically, it is a set of social norms that organizes both gender categories and sexual orientation categories in the following way, right? So it organizes, for instance, man and woman as a biologically based category, right? Biologically based categorization where being man or a woman is fundamentally innate, or at least it's attached to distinct sexes, and those sexes are innate, and it's purely biological. There's nothing social about it. Gender binary also tells you that people are almost entirely, or if not, entirely, either they're a man or a woman, and everybody is at least one of those, right? So that means you can't kind of escape being a man or a woman, and you can't be both, right? And finally, a gender binary, the set of norms, is also going to tell you that because of a person's biological sex or gender, um, there are substantive kind of social norms that should kind of hold on the basis of that, right? So, social norms like which restrooms you should use, what kind of clothes you ought to wear, how you ought to speak, how you ought to present yourself. There will be different modes of living depending on, importantly, what your kind of biological gender is. And remember, there's only two and exactly two. And so you have to find your place within that. It also, I talk about gender binaries more generally in terms of what they also say about sexual orientation, because they do also kind of have very rigid rules for basically, being either straight or gay. Um, and then what kinds of norms come with that, what kinds of biological conditions come with that as well, because often that's theorized as this kind of innate thing that people have. Sexual orientation is not changeable, it's very rigid, and everyone is either fits within one or the other. These gender binaries, they're they can kind of differ from culture to culture, so it shows up differently in different places, right? So what counts as manly and masculine versus feminine is not going to be universal throughout different societies, but I think many societies have versions of gender binaries, and there are lots of reasons why you might be concerned about or lots of reasons why you might be concerned about gender binaries, but I'll just mention one very kind of obvious one, which is questions around a person's individual liberty or freedom. So if you have very heavily entrenched gender binaries, and those gender binaries, for instance, are put into legal kind of put into the kind of laws where it's kind of legally mandated for people to behave in these ways, then that's going to be a case where it's going to clearly conflict with a person's wanting some degree of individual liberty where, if you're not hurting anyone, or if you're not, if you're not hurting anyone, you're not really doing anything other than deciding to wear makeup and be, or deciding to wear a dress, or deciding to, sit in a certain way, or have a certain name, or use certain pronouns, you should be able to do that without fear of kind of deadly violence, which often people are kind of experiencing as a result of not being gender conforming. You should be able to do those things. And also, the last thing I will add for this is that it actually creates a hostile conditions, or ironically, kind of strict enforcement of gender and sexual orientation norms create hostile conditions for even the people who are considered, I guess, the paradigm case of gender binary. So like cis straight women, for instance, So one of the things that happens when you have these gender norms that are really rigidly enforced is that, you know, in order to kind of rule out the possibility of someone who falls outside of the gender binary, so like a woman who, for instance, who for various reasons just does not want to kind of abide by this kind of feminine norms that are imposed upon her, to rule those people out, you kind of have to, affect a whole bunch of other people as well. So there'll be lots of people who are women or cis women who will think to themselves, I'm trying to conform to the binary, but nonetheless, those people will be kind of attacked as well in the event that they may be taller than the gender norms say a woman should be. So then there's a question of, are you really a woman since you're trying to break these gender norms, or are you really trying to, what are you trying to do here? Like there are these bad effects, I think, that come from rigid enforcement of gender binaries, even effects that hurt not just kind of gender minorities or sexual minorities, gender nonconforming people, trans people, but can in many ways harm people who would think of themselves as like just regular, I'm cis straight person. Why am I being targeted by this? I think it kind of hurts everyone.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we might get into some of the more ethical or broadly social issues there as well. But okay, so regarding gender binaries, well, one of the main motivations, or I guess accounts of how you could have this sort of gender binary, is that, well, it just tracks a fairly robust underlying biological binary, right? We might think there are males and females of the species, and that's something that's, if not exactly binary, like very close to one. And people say things in terms of chromosomes and gamete production and so on. I mean, what do you think about, well, I guess there's sort of two parts here. One, there being this strict or roughly strict biological binary, and two, the gender binary sort of tracking those or being the sort of same binary as that, if that makes sense. What do you think about that?
Good. So that's a really good question. So I'll start with kind of whether or not the gender binary, these social norms really track this kind of these biological properties, for instance. So suppose there are these, biological properties. So one thing that's interesting about, the the claim, right, what's interesting about this was a correlation between the gender binaries or gender norms, right, of this kind being based on biology, is that, you know, you would think that you wouldn't have to police people as much to get them to just obey the norms, right? So if being a woman is by its nature about being, you have certain kind of biological properties, and it leads to being nurturing, for instance, and being kind and motherly and so on, and being male, right? This is kind of hard biological fact that is expressed in the form of being tough and courageous and so on. You wouldn't really have to kind of pose very rigid norms that really at every turn require or push or expect people to take aboard these roles. People would just do them. I think that the problem with thinking about biological sex, for instance, as just determining these kind of gender norms is that it just doesn't happen. You have to have the gender norms as a kind of compliance mechanism. You have to be able to, in some ways, say, okay, here's what we're doing today, despite what you wanted to do. So you may not have wanted to organize yourself in the social world this way. You may not have wanted to wear a dress, but we're going to kind of more or less put you in a position where, depending on your anatomy, for instance, you're going to be much more comfortable wearing a dress as opposed to not, right? And some people are going to be, very uncomfortable wearing a dress given the kind of social norms we have in play. So I guess for that movement from biological sex to social norms, or thinking that norms just track this sex, I'm convinced by the fact that people really seem to not go intrinsic. They don't naturally go in that direction. Seems to be the case that you have to really do a lot to make it happen. And one example of this very quickly is, just a lot of the kind of recent legislation that is meant to different kinds of legislation that's meant to not just kind of make a descriptive declaration. So it's not just well, we have a biological theory of gender or sex, and so this is what we recognize. But, there's a lot of different things that have to happen on the basis of that according to these norms, where these people have to go to these restrooms and these people can't be over here and these people can't get this kind of health care and these people can't get this sort of thing. But again, I think if it's this kind of natural thing that just happens, we wouldn't have to police it as much. It would be like policing. It would be like, you don't have to encourage people to breathe, right? You're gonna breathe regardless. You don't have to encourage people to, they're gonna do it. So that's what I would say to the first part. Sorry, that was a little long. I can respond to the second part, but I don't know if there was something that arose during that part.
Well, no, that's good. I'm actually, I will, before we get to the second part on the biological categories being a binary, just a quick note on that. I could imagine someone saying something like, okay, but these gender norms and abiding by those gender norms are not what determines gender. So maybe someone could say like, well, suppose gender is primarily some sort of biological thing. It might be that there's certain norms associated with being one gender or another, but it's not like, maybe it's not a consequence or maybe even something you strongly expect that someone in a particular gender category would recognize or follow those gender norms, if that makes sense. So maybe they could think that those come apart.
Oh, yeah,
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I think they can come apart. So in my book, I have, to give an account of gender as social, you have to be able to distinguish between what ways of social positioning a person are kind of part of the gender membership, and then what kinds aren't. So, for instance, if you think that gender is social, you typically don't want to make the claim that, well, part of what it is to be a woman is to wear makeup or something like that. Saying, okay, well, that's not kind of part of what it is to be a woman, even though that's clearly a very strong norm that's imposed upon women. So you have to make that kind of distinction. So I make that distinction, in my book, and I try to say more about what kind of social properties that are taken to be indicative of a person, or sorry, what sort of socialization process creates what we might consider these kind of gender categories, where I don't have to depend on, these very specific gender stereotypes, like, wearing makeup or wearing a dress or something like that. So that gets a complicated kind of story. But I think that would be, I guess I would consider that a problem for something that the social constructionist has to think through. I think I have separate issues with the biological account, which I can say something about now, if that makes sense. So there are a couple issues with the biological theory of sex, or, I think of sex as kind of gender, but I'll just say for now, it's often put in terms of biological sex. So, as you know, there are people who say, listen, look, you can say whatever you want about gender, but there is this biological fact about sex, and there are two biological sexes. And, maybe this is the sort of thing that people need to focus on for various reasons. So I'll talk about some people who think you should focus on this for political reasons, and then people who think you should focus on this for medical reasons. And my basic response is to look at actually some of the definitions that people have proposed for what it is to be biologically male and female. And, the long story short is just that if you look at, okay, chromosomes, you look at, genitalia, you look at secondary sex characteristics. So like your, voice, Adam's apple, hair, bone structure. If you look at, reproductive ability, right? Whether you can produce gametes, as they say. The problem is that if you have all of these definitions, because of various kind of reasons, none of them end up capturing the people that we, in an everyday sense, want to put into the category of male and female. So a very simple example of this, to not get into the weeds, or, is as follows, right? The natural way to describe a person as male is, well, you have certain genitalia, right? So you have a penis. And so that's the clear way to know, whether or not you're male. But, there are lots of people who are considered men throughout history who, for one reason or other, they end up not having that genitalia, that kind of genitalia, either because of kind of issues from birth or very unfortunate episodes after birth, right? So this is a kind of simple counterexample to that kind of claim. Now, some of these theorists, I mean, you know, one thing you can say is you're kind of splitting hairs here. It's like, wait a minute. I mean, come on. Like that's sure, there's always going to be these cases where women don't have ovaries and men don't have penises and all. So or maybe you have the cases also of many of intersex individuals. Sure, sure, sure. But the argument is, well, maybe it's a small number of people and you're really kind of, you know, picking out all these exceptions. The thing that I want to kind of always kind of highlight about the kind of project that I'm engaging in is, you know, as a metaphysical project, part of what you're trying to do is give a definition that doesn't have exceptions, right? If the definition kind of has exceptions, then you're no longer in a position to articulate that as a definition. So the issue that comes up with a lot of the kind of biological sex binary based theories is just this sort of problem. While it may be very good at characterizing a large swath of the present human population. So some of those definitions I think can characterize a large number of people, right? And it classifies them correctly, given our intuitive judgments. And I think that's right, insofar as it's used for that. But again, the question for me and for the philosophers is, okay, there's a big difference between terms that we can use that are, you know, roughly accurate with respect to, you know, their use in the actual world. And is there some sort of deep substantive category or kind behind all of this, particularly one that can be useful in biology? And I think the answer is no for me. But, you know, I do think there's more to say, however, uh, about sex biology, right? So even though I don't necessarily accept the binary conception of sex, I do think there's an important role for considerations of sex in like medical contexts and also in context in any context basically where chromosomes, you know, or you know, testosterone ends up mattering, for instance. I just think the way that the binary kind of approach theorizes about this, their central issue is the division between male and female, whereas insofar as it matters for me, the division is in terms of the particular sex characteristics like testosterone, right? Like there are certain things, if you tell me about a person's testosterone levels, I don't need to know more to make certain relevant judgments about, you know, whether or not, you know, yeah, like making considerations of the evenness of playing fields in sports, for instance, right? Should the issue be about these categories of male and female on your birth certificate? I don't think so. I think what's more important is the actual detailed information that's going to be useful. Kind of like height restrictions in boxing. You know, it's not, you know, it's like, okay, who's, you know, we got to make sure people are this tall, or weight restrictions rather. We got to make sure people are this kind of weight. So it's much more granular the way I think about sex biology. And I think that can account for some of the appeal of binary sex. I think the appeal isn't the binary. I think the appeal is just, oh, okay, well, people have different sorts of biological properties that enable them to do different sorts of things. And that's fine. I mean, I don't deny that.
Good. I was just wondering something like, I mean, do you think one of the appeals of strict binary just is, well, I mean, people often assume that there are these kind of simple categories. There's really no room for vagueness or anything like, it's just like, insofar as you have the category, either you fall under one option or another, and there's no, or at least it really shouldn't be any sort of ambiguity or degrees in that. Although you could say more about the individual, not more with respect to membership in one of these categories. And maybe this is just a sort of common fact about language, that we sort of assume this sort of background logic or constraint on the way our categories function, or at least in particular as it applies to gender and sex categories. I mean, do you think that's going on here in particular, or what do you think about that way of characterizing?
Well, I think there's something like that is right. I mean, I think the one thing that makes this a little differently is that they come as a pair. You know, like this man and woman come as a pair, so they have to themselves be kind of, they're exclusive and exhaustive, and it's important that there's just two there. Um, uh, I think I think you're right, though. I think you're on the right track as far as the fact that One, I think ambiguity, uncertainty, and vagueness, those are psychologically, situations people don't want to be in. Just in general, I'm not even about, gender or sexuality. But I think once you introduce the element of gender, sexual orientation, sexuality, these are things that are fundamental and crucial to how people are living their everyday lives, how they orient themselves throughout the world, like who is who and what is what, and who's going to be dating who and who's a potential person to talk to. Like so many things depend on knowing a person's gender and or sexual orientation in this society. I think if you suggest that there are more than two kind of genders slash or genders or sexual orientations that you need to really be accounting for or thinking about, I think, or there's some fuzziness here on kind of where a person is positioned gender wise or sexuality wise. I think that can create a kind of crisis because, again, so much is dependent on knowing, okay, is that person a man? Because that I'm going to talk to them differently, depending on whether they're a man or a woman, or this person straight versus if I knew this person was gay or bisexual. That would, when you have two or three categories, those decisions, it's easy to make, right? There's only two options. Boom, you don't have to. But when things are open ended in the way I think they actually are, at least in many contexts, I think that can create a kind of anxiety, fear, and honestly, you may be just threatened because what happens in a world where if you spend your entire life mastering the art of being a male or a man or a woman, and you know how to position yourself that way, you know what straight people do or what men do or what women do, quote unquote, and how they appear. Well, what happens if there are these other categories? Where does your position in society become now? That itself can be a very threatening thing. So I do think there's a lot at stake on these particular kinds of concepts that I don't think there's a lot at stake in contrast with the concept of a teacup. It's just not as, if we get some ambiguity about or vagueness about the term teacup, it'll probably be fine. Like we'll probably, okay, whatever, I'll just use this other cup. Life goes on. With these other kind of concepts that are really kind of built into the fabric of reality, social reality, I think it could be a very scary thing. So I do kind of acknowledge that is one of the reasons why people are, why there's a difficulty there.
Yeah, I definitely see that, and I'm going to ask a few more things related to vagueness and indeterminacy in a bit. But I did want to, before that, turn to, well, what about more like social approaches, like social role approaches or norm relevance approaches or self ID views? I mean, what do you think about if you took a very social approach to what gender is? I mean, what are some of the strengths and weaknesses of that? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think one strength of some of the social constructionist views. So you mentioned two kind of views useful to spell out. So one is a social position theory. So this theory, kind of popularized in recent years by Sally Hassinger, says that what it is to be a woman is for you to be basically positioned in a certain position in society in a way that you are A, subordinated to men along various dimensions, and B, you're subordinated on the basis of whether you seem to have certain reproductive abilities, right? So this is a way that certain social theorists, particularly radical feminists and like even some like inspired by Marxists, the way they think about gender as, okay, sure, there's some, maybe there's some biological stuff out there, some reproductive stuff you have to keep track of biologically, but really what makes you a woman is not that. What makes you a woman is the fact you're incorporated into this system in society. And that kind of view, it doesn't really depend on kind of how you feel inside, right? Whether or not you're positioned as a woman depends on the people around you treating you in a certain way. Your individual identification doesn't matter in those type of accounts. Now, in the gender identity accounts or self ID accounts, This is going to be more familiar to people. I guess the general language of gender identity kind of is along this line. So this is the view that gender is social, but it's determined by the individual who has the gender. So it's to say, look, if you say I identify as a man, and you know, whatever that ends up meaning, whether it's an internal feeling or something you act out, or, you know, follow certain, you have a certain sensitivity norms, then that makes it the case that you are that gender. So if you identify as a man, you're a man; identify as a woman, you're a woman; identify as non-binary, so on and so forth. So that might be more familiar to folks. So for me, my view is those are, you know, I think really interesting kind of views of different kind of gender categories, different gender concepts. I think I don't I think the pro is that they can capture at least some of the issues around how do you actually have a unified category, you know, of, you know, man and woman or non-binary. Well, actually, I don't think they do a good job of non-binary, but, you know, they do a better job, I think, than the kind of biological accounts. But for me, I guess I'm thinking about, well, what am I trying to do when I give an account of gender? And this goes back to the methodological question. Am I trying to mainly give an account of how people use gender terms? Or am I trying to give an account kind of more generally, one that's consistent with how people use gender terms, but there's nonetheless something bigger going on? And I think that my spatial theory says, look, there are actually these other dimensions of being gendered, right? At least two dimensions. So being socially positioned in the way that Hassinger talks about, maybe that's one. But then also maybe there's the self ID element, right? Maybe that's another dimension. Um, so for me, I say, okay, I think these theories are promising, but I see no reason why we can't represent as a whole kind of what's going on with gender. So in my framework, I represent these different aspects of gender as part of this kind of multidimensional space. And then, you know, I talk about how people might be positioned differently along this space, and how maybe there are different gender concepts that kind of weigh more heavily towards certain features as opposed to others. So in many ways, I kind of try to incorporate these theories more as data as opposed to directly competing with them on the grounds of, oh, I'm trying to give a different account of how people pick out how people use terms.
Yeah. 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 I mean, just thinking about just on the descriptive level, like, I don't know. When I think about, at least historically, I mean, it gets a bit more complicated nowadays, but when I think of gender terms, I think plausibly primarily these were tracking things about sex and secondary sexual characteristics, but to some degrees also other social things like behavior and social roles and appearances and stuff like that. But I wouldn't be surprised if the sort of dominating feature that people were sort of tracking to, you know, whether to figure whether someone counted as part of some gender category was, you know, facts about their appearance and secondary sexual characteristics and stuff like that. But now, I mean, I don't know, maybe you want to say something about that. Maybe that's not right, but I'm thinking also, in a way, you could have cases where the sort of things that were tracked are, I mean, it's less clear whether someone falls under one category or another. It's just that maybe historically there weren't as many of those cases, or they weren't very considered, whereas nowadays they are being more considered, and also people are sort of testing exactly how to understand these categories and maybe pressing for one specification over another. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting at different things here, but
Well, I think that there are two things. I mean, I think that you know, again, part of the challenge isn't so much that the theories are trying to pick out biological properties. It's not, the problem is not that the the terms can't kind of, you know, pick out groups of people with certain biological properties. That's not really the issue. The issue is that when theorists are trying to give an account of how people are using gender terms in a consistent way, it's hard to get to figure out what are the biological properties you're trying to pick out, right? So you know, the you try chromosomes, but then you leave out these people. You try reproductive ability, then you leave out these people. You try this. So part of the kind of explanation for this that social theorists give is, well, look, partly and you see this in the social position theory. Well, you can posit there being this, these set of biological properties that do make for the right kind of intuitive judgments. We just somehow don't know what it is. Maybe it's like a cluster or some sort of combination of things, really complicated. Or you can just say, look, I mean, people, were concerned actually with the biology, but they were concerned with it in the way that Hassinger's theory, the social position theory, says you should be concerned with it, which is, you are attributing people a gender on the basis of whether you think they have certain reproductive abilities or think they should in principle or normally have certain reproductive abilities. And that's fine. It's tied to biology. But the issue ends up being whether or not, it's kind of it, this is a kind of biological category that's explanatory in some special way, or uh, whether it's some kind of invention that human beings came up with their own special purposes. So maybe one quick example though that helps with this is the distinction when theorists or philosophers of biology, for instance, how people think about animal sexes versus human sex terms might kind of be illustrative. So there's uh, in the kind of biological case, people think about sexes outside of human beings, and so one issue that comes up is just that, you know, whereas it's easier to just make a stand on kind of the not the non-human animal case is about what the sexes are, maybe if you think it's about like gamete production. The issue is that when it comes to human, like purported human sex terms, they don't seem to be used in the kind of nice neat way that they're kind of used in a non-human animal case. So the issue again, it turns out the issue turns on whether or not it's kind of picking out whether or not it's actually going to match how people use the terms. So it's kind of tricky. I mean, I don't know what to say about. So actually, sorry, I think I forgot the second part of your your question. Yeah, sorry, I might have missed your second part of your question. You said something at the end, but I totally forgot because I was trying to make sense of why.
Oh, well, I think what I was getting at the end, and I don't know, just kind of rambling, I suppose. But what I was getting at was something like, well, to some degree, it seems to me what's going on is that like when people are offering these maybe more precise definitions, like in terms of biological characteristics or social characteristics, so to some degree, that's sort of haggling over different precisifications, maybe
Oh, I
none of
see.
which are already licensed by existing, uh, semantics or something like that. Um,
Oh, I see.
if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, do you see that as something that's sort of going on? Yeah, I mean, maybe we talked about this already a little bit, but there's this sort of haggling over how to use these terms and what sort of norms we are willing to accept and other things related to that.
Yeah, I mean, there is like, so that's good. So it does, this brings you to this distinction that would be useful between, so we're thinking descriptively about kind of what is the case right now, but there's a different question of like how should we use our concepts? So a kind of conceptual engineering kind of debate, for instance. So this might be, for instance, this idea that what maybe we do use terms in ordinary language in a kind of confused, inconsistent way, or just maybe we're picking out a bunch of different stuff. But you might nonetheless say that, well, we need to kind of change our language so it's less messy, at least with respect to certain things. I think you do see a bit of that with both gender and, or I'll say man and woman. I prefer these as gender terms, but we can think of them as sex terms. With man and woman as terms, I think you can see consistent efforts to try to get, one kind of linguistic proposal to win out. So people are saying, look, regardless of how people actually talk, because maybe it's messy, who knows? But what we need to do, and you see this with the kind of federal kind of mandate in the United States, where it's like, look, the terms man and woman, this is what it will mean for us, like, period. This is how it's going to go. And, you have other people who kind of historically you say, well, when we use these terms, we should take them by default to talk about gender identity, express gender identity, because maybe the notion of gender identity has been kind of helpful for certain people, helpful for people in general. So I think you see this kind of linguistic kind of maneuvering and trying to identify kind of more precise or better kind of terms for different purposes. My view is that, so I don't talk as much about where, well, I definitely don't want to be too prescriptive in terms of how our linguistic conceptual practices, what they should be like in the future. I mean, I say some provocative things in terms of abolishing, the use of all these terms, or at least moving away from them. So I am a little provocative. But I mean, ultimately, I think what I would say about some of these cases is, I think one thing that would be useful would be to start thinking deeply about what is the purpose of the terms that we're introducing and trying to maintain, because whatever a person thinks about my particular kind of ethical, moral view, I think what I do want to point out is that some of the purported justifications for kind of changing our language don't really work. So, for example, the justification of someone saying, "Well, look, the reason why uh, we should use sex terms." In fact, this is a kind of stated justification for some people, some philosophers say, "Look, the reason why we should use gender terms as sex terms exclusively is that, well, maybe you think, okay, sex is a very neat category, it's male, female, and the social category is not. The social category is wild, great, wild thing. You can't really get any hold on it, etc." Suppose, that's the kind of proposal. The problem is that, well, but why do that though? I mean, who cares whether it picks out a neat category or a messy category? Whether it picks out a neat or messy category is going to depend on why we need it, right? So, teacup, I don't think that's necessarily a super unified category, but hey, it's pretty useful for, when I need to go to the store. I think getting down to what are the purposes of these classifications would be very useful. And that's kind of what I want to, at the end of the book, I try to, the main thing is to push people toward thinking not about what the terms represent, because I can even grant you that a term can pick out certain people or certain properties. But the question is whether or not that justifies certain uses of language or certain social policies. So that's kind of the kind of move that I try to make later on, where I have some distance from a particular proposal, but I'm trying to bring out, okay, what is the aim, not necessarily what does it describe? Because in many cases, I actually agree with people about what terms can describe.
Yeah, I see that for sure. Like, it's not just, it's sort of a bit short-sighted to think of this as just a merely descriptive project, when there's all these other norms and names and so on that might be relevant to the language and the, well, behavior and so on. I do want to get to, because one of the sort of key elements of the book is what you call the spatial theory of gender, and maybe it'd be helpful to, you sort of discussed that briefly already, but maybe if you wanted to introduce that a bit more, how is this a sort of model of gender? How does that work?
Good. So I'll think about it. I'll go back to my kind of metaphor or analogy. Favorite analogy is that of maps. So the way I think about gender, for instance, is, there are all of these different dimensions to gender. So I do think about kind of biological or sex properties that are part of the picture. I think about being socially positioned in a certain way as a different dimension. Think about self-identity as a different dimension, like do you self-identify or not? And all of these dimensions have, they're kind of like different kind of degrees, right, associated with them. So a person can identify as a man fully, right? Or they can, identify maybe like a little bit insofar as, you can have this kind of identification. It's easier in the case sometimes for audiences to see this in the case of sexual orientation, where if you one of the dimensions of sexual orientation is sexual desire on the basis of another person's gender or sex, then, there are lots of people who that desire comes in various degrees, right? They may be really into men, or they may be a little bit, into men, and or they may be completely, there's nothing, there's nothing there. And, you can do the different dimensions with, women and non-binary people, etc. So there's this idea first of, okay, you have all these different features and you have all these different kind of continuities or continuums, a spectrum, right? And so basically what I say, if you think about gender, sexual orientation as like these kind of, think of it as a two-dimensional plane, right? Where on one axis you have the social position dimension, and another axis you have the self-identification dimension. The thought is, for the spatial theory, when we are picking out gender categories or we're using gender concepts, what we're doing is basically carving out a region of this kind of space. So if you think about a map, right, again, you have the X and Y axis. And so keep it simple for now. We're going, going up, and around, so horizontal and vertical. And, you have your map and you can locate, right, a certain region of that space, North Carolina versus Texas versus New York. Those regions for me are going to be parallel to gender concepts, gender categories, or sexual orientation categories. They're just ways of grouping people based on this combination of different qualities people have to various degrees. So binary gender, I would say, is just a kind of simplified, right, map that kind of ignores a lot of the different kind of, regions that might actually be there. So it's kind of like an undifferentiated map. What I want to propose is not a different sort of map. So I'm not kind of saying, okay, we need to kind of have 1,000 genders, although, hey, if you want that, that's fine. My point is just to study basically the land, right, or the territory itself, and say, okay, look, here is human gender and sexual diversity kind of as represented by this abstract space, right? Here is all that's possible, at least in the actual world, right? And we're drawing boundaries, also around kind of what concepts we want to use or what regions we want to kind of talk about or think about in the actual world. That's perfectly fine. But the reason why I call my theory spatial theory is that it focuses on the underlying space, the underlying kind of coordinates, right? So you think of a GPS coordinate of, of a person. I think there's a GPS coordinate for gender and sexual location, right? I get that kind of granularity, not to go into kind of precisely where you are, located exactly, but this is just the idea that, okay, when we talk about gender and sexual orientation, I think we have to think about these concepts that we use in ordinary language as very coarse ways of referring to something that is very, very complicated, and something that comes in degrees, even though, right, the notion of a degree is not kind of, it doesn't really sound good. You never want to say a person is a half man or half straight. It is something that doesn't sound good in ordinary language. I grant you that. But I think there's something there. I think there's nonetheless, even if there's, reasons why we don't talk that way, there's something kind of there that can be understood and that can make sense, frankly, of a lot of people's experience. I talk to a lot of people, and the book has helped at least some people put a framework for how they were thinking about where they stood gender and sexually, when their only options in the culture are often, well, you're man or woman, or you're gay or straight or bisexual. And those kind of options are, very restrictive, and they don't really make sense of kind of a lot of the things that are going on, I think, in the wider sense of gender and sexual orientation.
Yeah. So there's there's a lot of things that we could talk about here. One thing to start, I'm thinking about though, is that I think most people will agree that there are these characteristics of people that come in various degrees, and you could model that with if you want like some map or some high dimensional space or whatever, however it works, and you can get your location in it. One thing I'm thinking about though is that, well, clearly there's going to be some sort of trade-off between having relatively simple labels and language and not thinking about these more precise details, even if they're true, like these are details of people. So like the simple language versus less informative versus, and on the other side, the more complex language, which may be in certain cases less useful or more difficult to use than, but it also carries more information. So like I don't know, how do you see this trade-off between like syntactic or conceptual complexity and informativeness and simplicity? And you see what I'm getting at there?
Oh yeah, so there's definitely a trade-off between, like the ease of use of having two or three concepts, right? Versus, okay, how am I supposed to cover this entire like space when, well, there's really an infinity of different concepts you could use, but even 12 could be a lot to handle. I mean, juggling 12 concepts around gender and then 12 separate concepts for sexual orientation. I think there's one I want to acknowledge. There's going to be a real trade off there. So in this book, I don't make a proposal about how to fully kind of overhaul language or anything, because I think that pragmatically and morally and politically, I don't think that's really, put it this way, there's a crude view which says, all right, look, tomorrow I need you to have 100 different gender concepts that understand and ready to apply them, and otherwise people are going to be mad and you're going to get in trouble or something like that. Or, that's not necessarily what I'm thinking. I think part of what I'm trying to point to is, look, even if it's unavoidable in the immediate term that we're going to have to use these concepts that often binary concepts. I mean, I don't think there's a way around using binary concepts to some extent. Nonetheless, I think there are lots of cases where we could reduce our reliance on these concepts and instead talk about the particular features that are relevant. So take the case I mentioned. I mentioned just two cases really quickly. So the one case is, I think I already mentioned it, which is, when people are thinking about competitive advantages and in the context of sports, they often appeal directly to, male and female, these very kind of coarse-grained kinds. But again, I wanted you to look at other cases in sports where people are trying to regulate competition. They're talking about really specific things like weight, or height, or there's specific kinds of properties you can talk about, which can do the thing that you want to do in terms of preserve kind of competitiveness and stuff like that. But you don't have to understand it in terms of this kind of male female, which is kind of biologically, I think, ends up being unverifiable or not. It can be, it's not going to work. Or take the case of, when people are thinking about sexual orientation. So, if you're trying to find someone, so one way to think about, the dating scene, for instance, is, okay, if you're straight, well, you're trying to find someone else who's straight. So it's kind of like, okay, I gotta make this coordination problem. And so, okay, I'm going to say that I'm straight, and another person says that they're straight, and then we can, I mean, another possibility though is, well, if you're a straight man, you can say, I want to date a woman, and then the woman can say, I date men. So notice, I mean, that at least reduces one set of binaries. So instead of having kind of a straight or gay, you can just specify the kind of gender or sex of the person. Again, it's not ideal, but you don't have to necessarily just use one set of binaries. Maybe just use sorry, you don't use both set of binaries. Maybe just use one. And the last case I will mention is that when it comes to gender terms and sexual orientation terms, there's a tendency to put a lot of different things on these terms. So I watch a lot of dating shows, and so this really comes out. So I'm confronted by constant examples of this where people are constantly saying to themselves, women are constantly saying to themselves in some dating shows, "Oh, I'm just looking for a real man. I'm looking for a man, a man, a man." And sure, there's a way of saying, okay, the concept of man here is used to describe some sort of social characteristics that they value, etc. You can do a kind of complicated thing, or maybe we could just start talking about particular qualities that a person is looking for without articulating it under that guise of "I want a man," or a straight guy says "I want a woman, I want a real woman," woman. You could say, "Oh, well, maybe I want someone who is gonna." A courageous person, a kind person, and maybe you do end up throwing in the kind of gender terms as well. But the thought is just to, not necessarily propose, everyone abandoning binary concepts or then introducing a billion new concepts that they have to then learn by the end of the week. It's more so, okay, what's the purpose of using this concept? Right? We often use these concepts out of convenience, but it's supposed to be a shorthand. But I think the shorthand can be disastrous, particularly with these cases where you have, two people, one person says, "I want a real man," another person says, "I want a real woman." But, there's no identifiable sense of what the people actually mean in that context. I think you can get some real problems socially and culturally by not willing to think about the particular properties. And maybe that's on the gender and sexual space, or maybe they're just independent properties. Maybe it's something actually completely different that we just, we're relying too heavily on these binaries. I think it's a real problem if we rely too heavily and not think about the underlying properties.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think there's definitely is some use for sure for thinking about some of these underlying properties. I mean, perhaps especially when there is disagreement about how to use the more generic terms anyway. Like in those cases, perhaps it can be, or in other cases as well, it could be useful to think in less controversial but more descriptive terms, perhaps. But I was also thinking, like, okay, when it comes to the spatial theory and thinking about gender kinds and the sort of dimensions in the space, what is it that like makes something gender kind? For example, because like there might be features maybe that are associated or correlated with gender, but we wouldn't think of them as like gender determining in the relevant sense. So yeah. So what do you think? I think you said something sort of about this already, but I don't know. What do you think about this?
Good. So that's a really good question. So in my book, I talk about so basically the main way in which I think these kinds are created or the way they work is you have some sort of prototype. So I think that with respect to kind of different gender concepts like male and female, or and non-binary, although you may wonder what is the prototype for non-binary. That's the question. With these concepts, they come with a prototype, which is a kind of idealized representation of within that culture or context, kind of what the ideal representation of a man or a woman is. And this kind of representation is often the basis for other sorts of kind of gender norms, basically. So within a society, my claim is this: within a society, people eventually come up with some sort of idealized sense of what a man or woman is. And then that ideal representation, so that prototype, is the basis for making additional judgments. So for me, right, and this is where we go back to the distinction between, what's part of a definition versus what is kind of additional norm. So take the norm that says women ought to wear makeup in this society or whatever society it is, right? So the thought is, look, women ought to wear makeup. It's not supposed to be definitional of women that they wear makeup. I don't think it's definitional. I don't think it's you're less of a woman because you wear makeup. Not in the relevant sense of less of a woman, at least. What happens is a society, you have to have these two things. So you have to be able to say first, what is the kind of person, like at a minimal level, that I'm going to impose this norm on, right? So I think what happens is society is basically operating a two-stage process. You have to have a very minimal sense of the ideal man and woman, and then often, and whether that's understood in terms of biological properties or different social properties or identity, right? There's different things it can be, but there has to be this sense of, okay, at the minimum, what would these people consist of? And there's prototype theory, this theory in cognitive science, which can kind of it says more about how concepts can be associated with or consistent prototypes. But then there is, okay, I have this ideal as a category, but now I want to say, what's the normative ideal as well? So I think that's where you get more substantive gender norms, because it's not enough to imagine, the ideal. So the descriptive ideal is like, oh, if you have a biological count, you say, oh, well, a woman, they have ovaries and they have, they're like this. And okay, you have a very minimal characterization. But then, you have these other kinds of prototypes that are not about the target of the norm. They're about the kind of broader content of the norm. So you say, okay, well, given people who fit into this category, who I've already defined using this ideal, here's how they ought to be, right? More generally. So that's where you get gender norms, I think, around women should be nurturing, or women should dress in a certain way, men should dress in another kind of way. I think you just end up with two different types of prototypes, right? One specifying, here's at the minimal level what a man or woman is. And another one is, here's what a man or woman ought to be like, right? And I talk about in the book, I give some evidence for this kind of hypothesis. So basically, the idea of a prototype, I think, can track judgments about stereotypes and different sorts of norms. And so in some of these cases, I think the best explanation of what's happening here is that people have two types, basically, or cultures or communities have two types of prototypes. One that are definitive, but they're more minimal. But then another type, which is more robust, and it says something really about how they think men and women ought to behave in the society.
I did want to, so there's another thing about the spatial theory that I wanted to get to. Well, so actually, when you're talking about prototypes here, and something else that comes up a fair amount in the book, and you've talked about it a little bit already, is issues of vagueness and indeterminacy, and something actually I'm a big fan of just generally when thinking about philosophical issues. I think we need to take vagueness seriously. There really are, just the way that a lot of our language functions, and perhaps especially in some of these categories like gender, there just is going to be vagueness. There's going to be, it's not developed in a way where every case is decided precisely. And you talk about different sorts of vagueness having to do with semantic vagueness and open texture indeterminacy. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if do you want to talk a little bit more about that and the sort of significance of vagueness here when thinking about gender?
Absolutely. So in the general philosophical literature, there's a lot of discussion about vague terms. So A vague term would be a term like bald, whether or not a person counts as bald. I'm not bald, at least not yet. And it's definitely true that I'm not bald. I have quite a bit of hair at the moment. Of course, if I completely shave my head, I would be bald. So that's definitely, if I shave my head, I would be bald. Or Michael Jordan is bald. I think he's still bald. I don't know. But, you have the definite cases. But, what's interesting about vagueness is, well, let's say I add one, start with someone who's completely bald and you add one hair to their head. Are they still bald? You think, okay, sure. Yeah, you're still bald. You just have one hair in your head. But then you add another one, you ask the same question, you add another one, ask the same question, you keep going on and on and on. At some point, the thought is, it's vague whether or not a person is bald. I mean, it's, at some point, it's not like there's a definitive hair number that you need to have in order to count as bald. It's vague. And with vagueness, it's importantly distinguished from uncertainty. So the idea is, well, it's not that, we're missing some special facts about baldness. It's not like, oh, we were still investigating how many hairs does it take to be bald. It's like, look, we have all the facts. The problem is it's just indeterminate at a certain point whether a person counts as bald. It's just vague. As you point out, it's something that's very common in philosophy to acknowledge in different kinds of phenomena. I think that in the social case of terms, gender terms, sexual orientation terms, I think that it's even more kind of pressing the issue of vagueness and just kind of fuzziness in general, or kind of blurry boundaries. So the straightforward case of this is thinking about sexual orientation. So it's very common with people who are thinking about their sexual orientations, where if we think about sexual orientation, it has a very important dimension of desire, sexual desire, that can just more straightforwardly come in different kind of degrees, right? More desire, less desire, stronger desire, weaker desire, and so on the basis of a person's gender or sex. And kind of one thing that happens in those sorts of cases is that I think you just get a lot of indeterminacy with respect to some people's sexual orientations, or whether or not they truly count as straight. Many people are kind of, at the borderline, so to speak, and so it's just indeterminate. It's vague. I think this is something. Vagueness is something that affects different parts of philosophy, as you point out. But I think what's interesting about it in the social case is that, unlike vagueness around whether or not, the cup I have in front of me is a teacup, vagueness around socially significant terms like gender terms or sexual orientation terms, that informs how a person's to live their life in a very, very fundamental way. So whether or not it's determinate, whether or not the cup in front of me it doesn't really matter whether the thing in front of me is determinately a cup, right? It's just, maybe it's vague. Who cares? It's fine. Like nothing turns on this. However, right, for many people, right, it's going to make a really big difference whether a person is determinedly straight or gay when dating, right? And so when it's no fact of the matter about whether you occupy a certain sexual orientation category, and then people are dating and trying to find the one, well, wait a minute, there's a lot more that is suddenly at stake, that indeterminacy for that practical problem or practical issue you're trying to resolve. Or if you're just an individual person and you're trying to think about how you ought to think of yourself, and you come to the conclusion that actually, I'm not fully in either of the categories, that I'm not fully within this category. I'm not fully out of it, but I'm not fully in it either. Well, that too provokes kind of really hard questions about how do you think about yourself in light of that kind of vagueness. So I think the vagueness in the social case creates this really kind of interesting and challenging dynamic where, sure, there's vagueness, but I have to confront it in a way that I don't really have to confront it with other sorts of things like the cup, or you know, the game console versus a PC. At this point, is it really a console or is it just a PC? Those kind of things, they don't provoke the same kinds of problems or questions.
Yeah, I see. I often think like oftentimes we develop our language in a way like there are exceptions, but like to some degree we make it as sort of as precise as we need it, like for various purposes. And like you bring up some cases where like it looks like, well, for the cup or something, so those sort of ambiguities we don't really care about, so we're not that concerned or pressed to precisify it in some way to handle them. But for things like sexual orientation, perhaps, and maybe certain gender categories that have certain consequences for action and behavior and discourse and so on, or that we just care about, maybe we do abhor the sort of ambiguities that where they prop up, and so we're sort of pressed to precisify it. And is that sort of what you'd agree to that?
Oh yeah, I absolutely think that's definitely, I think, a huge part of the picture. I mean, it can go a bunch of different ways though, because there's, so for instance, one thing you get, so there are basically two strategies for people sometimes when it comes to these kind of emerging or like dealing with the vagueness. So one thing you can do is try to become more fine grained. So, that's when you get very complex distinctions between bisexual versus pansexual, asexual versus gray sexual, and so on, a demisexual versus demiromantic. So you get more fine grained. That's one response. If you feel like there's vagueness and you want to solve this for certain purposes. Another response, though, is actually to just, be more coarse grained. So, queer as opposed to, gay or lesbian or bisexual, just queer as a concept. So that's like it's very coarse grained. It's a very coarse grained concept. Some people have went to that concept in response to different kinds of vagueness at the lower levels, or vagueness with respect to kind of a lot of the stuff that the concept queer ends up covering. So I think there are different strategies that people take. And I think one thing that makes it challenging to think about this case is that I think these gender and sexual orientation terms, they're kind of like multifunctional tools, right? People are using them for different reasons. They're applying them because of different sorts of functional roles that they play. I think about this a lot with sexual orientation. It's like you're trying to do this interpersonal thing where, these concepts are means to coordinating relationships or sexual relationships on the one hand. On the other hand, they're means to understanding oneself as an individual, to just know, okay, who am I? What am I? On the other hand, they're used as legal. There's a lot of legal laws that are built on the basis of, whether a person has or a member of a certain sexual orientation category, or whether a certain gender category. So there's so many things that's being done with these concepts. It's hard to say uniformly how people are responding to the vagueness, but the general thing I do notice with this is that because these concepts are so heavily integrated into society and how people think about just navigating the world, the vagueness that exists has much greater consequences by far. It's just not clear how should people respond. Precision, make it more general, stop thinking about the categories at all. That's a tricky area that I don't really address in the book, and it's kind of a starts the seeds for a different research project, which I'm working on now, actually.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, but I could see someone, and this is something you talk about in the book, and you've mentioned a little bit already, but like I could see someone reacting to this and saying, like, look, these categories, it's all a big mess. Maybe it's fundamentally flawed and so variable, and it's like maybe it's just not worth the cost and having to figure these things out. Maybe we should just abolish gender talk altogether, or maybe weaken it in such a way. You talk about that as well. Where do you, well, what do you think about those sort of reactions, and like how do you prefer to approach it, like going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think I do. I do respect the spirit of the idea. So we can represent this position as kind of on an opposite extreme from a more conservative position. So conservative position is, let's continue using concepts in exactly the same way we've been using them. The binary concepts, they're good enough, no change, that's it. More radical abolitionist position is, let's just like get rid of these concepts entirely. Why bother with gender concepts? We just don't need them. And I think there's a couple issues that there are a couple of challenges to that sort of thing. So one, I think, well, I mean, mainly I think there can be at least some legitimate uses in the immediate term of gender concepts. They particularly thinking about the political case where in order to secure rights for people on the basis of the sexual orientation, you got to have concepts that identify what their sexual orientation is. And so the very possibility of that kind of project, which I think is worthwhile, even if it doesn't get you everything you might want, you're just going to need some of these concepts. You're even going to need some of the binary concepts. It's not going to work without those. And also, I mean, I think there's a danger of, kind of, so this, as a philosopher and academic, you have to be careful because you don't want to create this grand conclusion that, tells ordinary people kind of to change radically all their practices because of your theoretical argument or because, I think that's a kind of dangerous thing. I think in order for social change to happen, insofar as it happens successfully, I think there has to be a fair amount of bottom up innovation when it comes to that kind of thing. And I think people are doing this kind of bottom up innovation. I think some of these concepts that have emerged recently or seem to have emerged recently are the result of people kind of really thinking through kind of what kind of terms, concepts we want to use to capture different aspects of our identity. So, I wouldn't want to endorse the radical immediate proposal because it's not desirable in many ways. I think you really do want to take people's practices seriously, even if you think, as I do, that there's some kind of deep problems with some of these concepts that people are using. But again, I'm using them too, so I'm kind of part of the group of people, and we're just trying to figure it out. So I would be skeptical of such a radical kind of approach without considering alternatives, without thinking about, well, how can we reduce our reliance? I think is my first kind of proposal here. Like, okay, what would it be to reduce reliance? Even just thinking about it, I think would be a good step.
Yeah, that seems very reasonable to me. And then, but another thing that you've touched on a bit, but I want to comment on, when it comes to applications of this, like, okay, we're thinking about things like bathrooms and sports and medicine. You might say, okay, well, maybe it's not the gender category per se that is needed or most relevant there, but like some other factors like weight and testosterone and so on. Maybe someone might agree, but like, I guess there's two concerns. One, how do you go about deciding what things are relevant or most important there? And two, I guess someone could say that, okay, maybe in principle, if looking at more fine differences or characteristics might result in, fairer class differentiation or something like that. But for simplicity, or maybe partly for tradition, maybe we still want to stick with existing primarily sex-based categories or something like that. I don't know. I guess I'm getting at a couple of different things there, but
no, those are good questions. I mean, I think in the first case, I would say that that would be part of. I think part of the thing is, taking a hard look of what you want your sport to be, right? What do you want? What exactly? So I think part of what I do in my work is start to challenge people to be reflective about, okay, what exactly are we trying? Why are we trying? What does the evenness consist of exactly, right? So I think often when it comes to these kind of policies, there's a vague sense that like, well, we want the people who are likely to be stronger or something or faster to not, just overwhelm the people who are not likely to be stronger and faster if, they're both kind of born in the, they're just, okay. So there's this kind of vague sense of, okay, we that's what we're trying to preserve. But I think, what, and so you might just easily say, oh, well, it's just male, female. And so that's the easy way to do it. But I think that, if the stated argument is, well, I'm trying to preserve, competition, right? And I think that's worthwhile. I think that means one does have to really think reflective about, okay, what kind of competition am I trying to preserve? I think you have different options. And so I think for me, it's really more of the sports trying to determine what kind of sport they want. I think in the past, the thought is, well, there are these kind of biological categories that kind of set the record straight. And so it's easy to make sense of fairness and competition by just doing it on a sex-based way. I mean, people tried this for quite a bit. It's always been like not workable practically for various reasons, because you always end up with cases where, it just doesn't, the sex-based criterion they use just often doesn't classify certain people in the way they intuitively want to classify people. But I would say, okay, well, if it's really about competitive advantage or fairness, then you just have to find a criterion that works, and you have to apply it evenly, and know that applying it evenly is not going to get you the kind of results that you might have expected, right? Because often there's an expectation that if you use some of these criterions based on chromosomes, it's going to easily you're never going to run into exceptions or people who you want to classify as being in one gender or sex, but then they don't fit. So that's one option. Now, second option, though, and this is interesting, I think is more defensible, even though I think there's going to be some questions around how to apply it. So one thing you might say is, well, we're not doing this for reasons of, competitive advantage. Maybe it's reasons of convenience or reasons of tradition, right? So those are reasons I think I'm like that can actually more compelling to me. The big thing though there is, questions around, balancing convenience versus kind of respecting people or people's rights and stuff. So, you're always going to have to make convenient judgments, frankly, about who's included in competition or what kind of criteria you're using for anything in a sport. So you're always going to have some convenience there. There's no, like where exactly is the strike zone? It's kind of like you're always going to have to make some decisions. But I think the question is just going to be kind of, is the sex binary actually the most convenient thing? Or are there other things that can be convenient that can nonetheless preserve other things that are more convenient, or other things that can better preserve people's sense of dignity in cases where you kind of seems like you're just kind of intentionally targeting people who have certain gender identities. And yeah, the tradition thing, I guess I would say that's an interesting case. And actually, I like the idea of it, but I think what would have to happen would be like, I don't know, saying what the tradition is, right? I think that's the thing. I think, in my work, I talk about how, strictly speaking, right, you could have a view where, you say, okay, I don't think there's any biological unity to sex categories, but you know what? I'm still going to use the term because, I can, I'm just intentionally, this is a mess of whatever. There's not this, I know it's not biologically explanatory. I know that there's no gender norms that result from it. It's just this stuff. But strangely, people just generally don't do that. It's much more often that, it seems to come with a lot. So I would be really curious about the last kind of proposal you mentioned. I haven't seen it, or yeah, I would be curious about how that what that would look like. But I think that would be more defensible probably than arguing flatly on the basis of a fair competition. I think those kind of arguments, you know, they assume that the only way we could account for differences in ability would be to appeal to sex binaries. But I think there are lots of ways. There are ways that in sports that distinction is already being made. And so a similar thing with the medical case, you know, there are ways to identify kind of medically what people need that are somewhat fine grained. And, you know, maybe the sex categories can be shortcuts, but again, just kind of, in some cases, I don't know if the trade-off makes any sense.
Good. Yeah, I'm going to wrap up in a bit. We have been going for quite a while, but just a couple of things before wrapping up. One, what do you recommend? Because it doesn't seem to me that the sort of disputes and oftentimes emotional disputes about these things are going to subside anytime soon. How do you recommend broadly or in our social interactions, like approaching these things? How do we make progress there, I guess, and how do we approach it, do you think? Or is that, yeah.
Good. So I'll say, you know, I can say a little bit and hopefully can answer the question. So I'm thinking that part of what a lot of people, I'll say this, many people approach me, right, and learn about this book I was working on but now published. And one of the things that I think helps people grasp or work with this kind of stuff is just not necessarily what we ought to do, but what is going on, right? So this comes a lot from parents, right? Parents approach me and they say, you know, my child is, you know, they're saying, wait, why do they don't want to use he she pronouns anymore? They don't want to use the pronouns. Okay, we don't really know quite, you know, what's going on, or, you know, their you know, son or their daughter is no longer calling themselves lesbian. Now they're queer, but they're like, wait a minute, this isn't queer. I mean, lesbian isn't that queer? Like, what's going? So I think people are trying to figure out what's going on, and also with the kind of gender identity and gender transition. There's a lot going on, and I think one immediate tendency is to, you know, whether out of fear or whether there's propaganda, so on, is basically expect the worst, right? Assume the worst, right? So when you don't understand, like, these seemingly new developments in society, I don't think they're really entirely new, but when you see these things crop up, you may say, well, okay, it's just going to be straight chaos, you know, and then all sorts of your mind can go to all sorts of places about what it means for society now that the binaries have been, there's kind of pushing at them, right? I think for my book, I guess what I would suggest for people in the first instance is to step back and think about what is going on in some of these cases and try to get a better grasp of, you know, I guess the kind of diversity, I think, of gender and sexual orientation. So instead of coming to these things with a preset conception of what gender and sexual orientation must be and what we ought to do on the basis of that, I think there's these granular questions that are worth asking around these gender and sexual orientation categories. And I think when that happens, I think once we get to a place where we can ask these questions, then I think at the very least there can be a conversation, right? So I think my book, I think, is modest and I think realistic in the sense that it's not going to, and I don't really try, it's not going to kind of make a person suddenly change their view into, you know, I don't know, adopting a billion gender and sexual orientation concepts or wanting to abandon all these concepts or taking some little radical political position. I don't. That's not what I'm trying to do, and that's not what it's going to do, regardless. But what I think I am able to make a contribution around is to say, okay, here's why. Here's why, you know, a person doesn't quite see how to locate themselves given the binary kind of concepts that are kind of imposed on people. Or here's why, you know, there's a lot that may be compelling about the binary notions of sex, even though it doesn't seem like the concepts really hold up if you're trying to do it as a metaphysical thing. Or here's why, right? There are all these complications that occur when you think about gender outside of the binary, or in gender nonconforming and trans identity, and kind of combining that with, you know, sexual orientation and what does that actually look like. Here's why you get these kinds of conflicts. And I think I would rather create a space. I would rather create a space for people to discuss and have some language to discuss, because I think that would at least allow people, policymakers, to actually have a conversation. Because right now, I don't think we have a conversation in the public. I think in the public, we have a series of talking points. And the talking points are, you know, sex versus gender, or versus gender ideology. And like we have more of a war going on, as opposed to a dialogue or a kind of collective trying to figure out what's going on and why and what we should do next. That's what I'm hoping for. I'm hoping for the latter sort of thing. And I hope my book can help develop a framework for thinking through some of these issues.
For sure. Yeah, and I definitely think it does. I definitely think it does that. Yeah, I mean, we could definitely keep going on a lot more, but I don't want to keep you too long. And I do normally like kind of ending with a more general meta-philosophical question. So, I mean, what do you think is some of the value of philosophy, maybe generally, or maybe think about the value of philosophy of, you know, for thinking about about social ontology and social categories and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think one great thing about philosophy, particularly in the social philosophy case, I think it really challenges you to reflect. Sorry. I think in the case of social ontology and social philosophy, it challenges you to think about, you know, questions and themes that are kind of deeply related to just your everyday existence, right? So people thinking about gender and sexual orientation, you now have to actually reflect. So you can't just rely on maybe what you grew up with, maybe what you kind of listen to your podcast or you watch a YouTube video. Maybe there's a very important self-identity that you might have of yourself, and that's kind of informing, you know, what you think gender is, sexual orientation, or we go expansive. We talk about, you know, race, or, you know, racial politics and things like that. So, but now, right, you go to a philosophy classroom or you start doing philosophy and you're faced with these challenges. And I think it's one of the greatest things for a person to be able to, like, have their, you know, you have your antecedent beliefs system and it's challenged. And instead of just kind of doubling down, you are in some way engaging with the challenges. You're really interested in trying to figure out what's going on, even though there's actually stakes for you in understand and trying to figure out what's going on. It can be a genuine, like, it can be genuinely unsettling to have your beliefs about the social world challenged, when those beliefs are the very thing that allow you to get up and go to work. I mean, some people, you're kind of like, listen, this is my belief system. That's the only reason why I'm going to work today, you know, because I believe that if I work hard, I will get what I deserve in terms of monetary benefits. And if I, you know, if that's your kind of belief system, and you have social theorists, political philosophers who kind of reject that, it can be pretty threatening. But again, I think that's the very interesting, cool thing about this kind of work is that because it's so close to home, you really have to grapple with philosophy truly as like the love of wisdom, right? Because, you know, you cannot to some extent separate out the results of your investigation with, you know, what you're likely to do in your everyday life, right? And I don't know, I think that's a really nice thing about this part of philosophy. You don't, it's not necessarily true of all parts of philosophy, this kind of connection. And I like the challenge. I love the intellectual challenge of it because it does force you to engage and also like not just rely on what you already believe or what the people around, what your friends believe and what you would want to be true. It is a very challenging thing to kind of try to grapple with that and be fair as best you can.
I agree, definitely agree with all of that. But yeah, it's been really great having you, Professor Richardson, and yeah, having a chance to talk about this book and getting your comments on it and your answering the questions. It's been really great having you.
All right, thanks. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks again. This is so great.